Speaker, today I am pleased to speak to Bill C-81, an act to ensure a barrier-free Canada. Almost every Canadian family either has or knows someone with a disability. Either it be someone who was born with it or become disabled sometime throughout their life. I have long advocated for the rights of those with disabilities, as I know firsthand the challenges and barriers that they face on a daily basis. My own son, who fell in a work-related accident 14 years ago last week, has shown me how someone who, through tremendous perseverance, can come through great adversity. And there are great Canadian heroes, such as Rick Hansen, who have inspired millions around the globe. Through his Man in Motion World Tour, he raised awareness and helped raise millions of dollars for research. To this day, Rick has continued his advocacy and is a beacon of hope to all those who are impacted by disability. And in my own constituency, my annual charity golf tournament has donated thousands of dollars to the Rick Hansen Foundation and Special Olympics. Our society has come a long way in recognizing that those with disabilities have a lot to offer. They are full members of society and must have the same access and rights as anyone else. I am proud to belong to a party that has advocated and supported many of the measures that have improved the lives of Canadians who suffer from a disability. Just next month, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney will be inducted into the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame for his steadfast support and for being a strong national leader on this issue. He was the first Prime Minister to appoint a minister responsible for disabled persons. This ensured that there was an advocate for the disabled around the cabinet table. His government also created the Disability Persons Participation Program, which dramatically increased support for organizations involved with disabled people. And it was his government that expanded disability-related deductions for income tax purposes. And let us never forget that it was the Honourable Jim Flaherty who implemented the Registered Disability Savings Plan and heavily invested into the Opportunities Fund to help persons with disabilities get the necessary training to obtain employment. These are just some of the tangible actions that have dramatically improved people's lives. We know the first step of breaking down barriers involves education and helping people better understand the everyday challenges that those with disabilities face. Since elected as the Member of Parliament for Brandon-Souris, I have been a staunch advocate for the Enabling Accessibility Fund, which has supported projects that have made buildings and community infrastructure more accessible. Just this summer, I worked with a community-led organization in Ninette, Manitoba, to make it easier for those in wheelchairs to access Pelican Lake. I have worked with communities to secure the necessary funding to renovate bathrooms in places like the Deloraine Theatre so they can be accessible for seniors. I worked with the Brandon Legion so that veterans can now access all parts of the Brandon Legion, so that the veterans can access all parts of their building now as well. These are just a few of the projects that have happened in my neck of the woods, but they are a good reminder that you don't have to reinvent the wheel to make buildings or workplaces more accessible. I am encouraged that this legislation is establishing proactive, compliant measures. Making buildings and workplaces accessible should never be an afterthought. It should be at the forefront of any architect's or engineer's plans. It's important that we actually have common accessibility standards across the board. While I note that this legislation only impacts federally regulated workplaces, it is my sincere hope that it leads to a much broader conversation within provinces and territories. I believe there is willingness across the country to get this done. There is such opportunity for businesses and organizations to encourage as many people as possible to either be employed, volunteer, or to shop. I have been inspired by my colleague from Brantford Brant, who passed his motion in the last Parliament that called on Canadian employers to take action on hiring persons with disabilities. He started a much-needed conversation about the benefits of hiring people with disabilities and improving their quality of life. I also want to highlight my colleague from Carleton, who led the charge earlier this year with his Opportunities for Workers Act. I strongly support his efforts to reform government policies that financially punish people with disabilities when they get a job, earn a raise, or work more hours forcing them to remain jobless and in poverty. He had widespread support for his legislation, and I know that he will continue to be a strong advocate for disabled Canadians. And to provide one more example, my colleague from Tobic-Mactaquac championed his Motion 157, which encourages builders and contractors to adhere to visitability guidelines and to be proactive when constructing new buildings. I believe his motion helped inspire many of the elements contained in C-81, and I applaud him for all that he has done in this area. As with any new regulation or law, we must always be mindful about the costs that will be borne by those who will be impacted. The other element we have to look at is what it will cost taxpayers to implement, enforce, and measure. It costs money to hire people and to perform the day-to-day operations of a new federal entity. I think all members would agree that we should measure the success or the deficiencies of a particular program or organization. The question at the end of the day is, does the federal government need to set up completely new bodies, or can we find ways to harness existing resources? While the fine details will be worked out at a later date, I would urge the government to focus squarely on tangible outcomes and projects that will improve accessibility. It would be disappointing if all the dollars allocated for this legislation just created new full-time equivalents rather than going into bricks and mortar projects. These are the sort of questions that must be asked up front, as once a government entity is created, it is normally quite difficult to make the necessary changes down the road. Now, because this legislation only impacts federally regulated workplaces, most small businesses and community-led organizations will not be directly impacted. Saying that, the federal government must work hand in hand with federally regulated workplaces and the disabled community. For this legislation to have the impact that we all want, it cannot be drafted in a silo or entirely by the civil service. The regulations and standards must be written in easy-to-comprehend language. There must be crystal clear expectations, coupled with appropriate enforcement measures. I also encourage everyone involved to look for best practices in the various provinces, but also around the world. And we must make sure that we do not just create another bureaucratic institution. Building a new institution that just creates mounds of paperwork and has limited buy-in from workplaces will not be in anyone's best interest. I know that when this legislation goes to committee, there will be great interest. It would be prudent for the government to provide the committee with as much information as possible so there is meaningful dialogue. It is imperative that the minister spends the necessary time to get this right. And I will definitely be voting in favour of this legislation so that it gets the proper study and engagement it so rightfully deserves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments.